All right. Hey, welcome everybody. I think we're ready to roll here. And I know this because I have sufficiently power posed in advance to get into the right frame of mind. And I have a fresh cup of tea right next to me to keep my voice strong. So let's get started. So our topic today is the General Data Protection Regulation, or commonly referred to by its acronym GDPR. And it's being presented from what we think is a uniquely American and a bit of a practical perspective. And while some of the attendees continue to join this webinar, I have a couple of admin items to get out of the way right off the bat regarding our webinar. So we do have a large audience joining us, which requires us to keep all attendees on mute during the course of the presentation, but we are recording this event and we'll be distributing a link to it plus a copy of the slides as a reference after its conclusion. If you have questions, we do encourage you to submit them via the questions function within the GoToMeeting console, and we'll either answer them during the course of the presentation, or if it's time permitting, or afterwards, we'll follow up with replies to those. Also, we're going to be inserting some attendee polls to gauge your perspective at several points and ask that you reply when prompted with those. All right, so on to the agenda. I think we're taking a bit of as I mentioned, a different approach to this topic. And today's discussion will really be less focused on the a compliance risk assessment or a deep dive into the specific components of the regulation. And we're going to focus more on the practical or tactical initial steps that an organization can do via the deployment of a technology solution to address some pretty basic business processes that may arise as a result of the regulation. So for our agenda today, we're gonna start off with a brief overview of the GDPR, and then we'll quickly segue to describing some relevant considerations of the regulation, and also sharing some of our ideas on some practical and inexpensive actions that a company could do to get started using, what we like to think of as an easy to understand case scenario that will help us frame the discussion. We'll also present an emerging technology solution that uses auto-classification capabilities to address several of the likely key business processes that will arise from the GDPR. And finally, we'll wrap things up with some concluding thoughts and takeaways. And all told, we expect to run 45 or so minutes today, but we've reserved this virtual room for a full hour. We won't go over, though. So by way of introductions, my name is Thomas Bonk, and I'm a Vice President of Global Professional Services at Epic, and I'm based here in Chicago. I'm very pleased to be joined today by two of who I consider some of my favorite colleagues in the industry. So, David?
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining, or good morning, depending on where you are. David Rohde here. I am a former litigator who now consults in the IG space, and have done a fair amount of preparatory work with my colleagues and corporations on GDPR readiness and impacts of that coming regulation. And I'm very happy to be here today. Sandy?
Hi, I'm Sandy Serkis. I'm the President and CEO of Valora Technologies. Some of you know that we have a pretty tight relationship with the folks at Epic, coming up right on our 1-year anniversary. And some of you have also been following the webinar series with Julie Colgan and myself on auto-classification. That makes a nice bookend to this one. But today we're really going to focus on GDPR, as Tom said, and some very practical applications to solve some of the dilemmas that poses.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Sandy and David. So my sleeves are rolled up. David, let's start with you. And the first topic we want to tackle today is what is GDPR and why should a U.S.-based company care about it? That's certainly a broad question. Can you help us frame an explanation of that?
Sure. So I guess that's really a very fundamental question. Why is a European data privacy regulation of interest or concern to American entities? And I guess that stems from the interconnectedness of the world we live in now, and a fundamental shift in the viewpoint of privacy from the European and the US perspective. At its core, the GDPR is a set of rules governing how the personal data of individuals is processed, and it's applicable to customers, employees, and supplier personnel who are residing in the EU. And so it doesn't matter geographically where you are, it matters where the data subject, the person whose data is at issue, is residing. And that's how we get impacted here in the US. And the GDPR is not new per se. It is a reimagination, a reimplementation, and a regulatory framework that modernizes and harmonizes the 1995 EU Privacy Directive, and that's been in place for a considerable amount of time. It also modernizes the privacy perspective and the coverage of the rules to embrace that interconnectedness, the Internet of Things, the exchange of data at such a high frequency, the traffic in analytics, the sharing, the storing, the reuse of data that is part of our new landscape. At its core, any information about an individual that is collected and or stored in such a way that it can be tied back to that individual, so identified or identifiable is the standard, is subject to the GDPR if that person is resident in the EU. We'll talk a little bit about consent and what's subject to the rule in just a moment. But I think one of the things that is got everybody's attention is that last section on the slide, penalties. People have been talking about penalties as a means of getting attention. They are significant for two-tiered structure in imposing penalties. For minor infractions, you could find yourself in the lower level penalty section, up to 10 million or 2% of the worldwide annual revenue, or turnover as it's called. 20 million euros, or 4% in the higher tier for more egregious or intentional or reckless breaches of the GDPR framework. So those are certainly attention-getting, but as the regulation is not implemented yet, and the data protection authorities haven't started, any of the enforcement mechanisms, we don't know how this is going to come down, who is going to be targeted, and what the process is going to be for going after or seeing these penalties in play.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, David. This certainly, like many, this initially got my attention when the GDPR hit my radar a few years back. And I will say, I tried this on my kids over the weekend. I told them if they did not behave, I was going to ground them up to 15 years. And it didn't really resonate, and they were kind of confused by that dictate. But that's a little bit like what this is as well. I think this, putting an upper boundary, but not really describing, any other context other than the high level limit. I guess it's intentional to get folks' attention, but it's anybody's guess, at least from what I can tell, as to what actually will happen once the regulators start to examining these infractions. All right, so if we can, what I'd like to do is, or what we'd like to do is to frame our discussion with a use case of a quote-unquote a typical American corporation. David, can you walk us through the scenario that's listed on this slide?
Sure. So in this case, we're dealing with a retailer, someone who is collecting information about a customer who is engaged in commerce with them, and maybe it's a loyalty card or a rewards program, and you provide your personal data, you receive some benefits, maybe it's a discount, maybe it's an early invite to a sale, something we've all seen happen out there in the world very, very commonly. That retail company is going ahead and completing a transaction in most cases, buying goods or services in exchange for the money that was agreed upon. And in an ancillary fashion, they are collecting either the same or more personal data about the consumer than is necessary for the completion of that transaction to service the rewards program, the loyalty program. That information that is gathered by that person isn't necessary for the straight up transaction, but it is subject to further processing. That is to say, further analytics, further use of that data for a purpose unconnected to the original purpose for which it was provided, the transaction, and then the purpose for the loyalty club card. So that gets us into a place where we have information about a person, and we'll assume this person is resident in the EU, and that information comes into our possession. In the US, we have a very different view of how we can use that information, reuse that information, and we may disclose some or all of those uses in a privacy statement that's a click or two away, that may be in a long, very detailed statement that is not necessarily putting front and center the subsequent or onward transfer of that data to another person, an aggregator or a marketing research company or somebody else who might put it to use. Those are the types of things that are very concerning to the EU data privacy regulators. Those are the things that they want front and center. They want unambiguous consent, and they want the data around European EU residents to be used for legitimate purposes with prior permission. And what we have in that circumstance is something different than we have in the US. We have the creation of something that's like a license. The data subject, the person providing this information, is giving us, the corporation, a license to use the data for some boundaried set of transparently communicated purposes. And those purposes are the limit of what a company can or should use that information for to be compliant with the GDPR. And in connection with that license, that grant of information usage by the data subject, there comes also some rights to the data subject. And that right, one of those ways that right is expressed is through the DSAR, the Data Subject Access Request. That mechanism allows the person who gave us the data to request the information that we are holding about them. And that's a big deal. It's a big deal not because it's brand new. DSARs have been around for a long time, but it's interesting because the GDPR removes the cost barrier to requesting this information about yourself, and it shortens the time period in which the organization needs to respond to the request for information. And the requestor can request this information of you for a bunch of purposes, for reasons that go to the integrity of the data and your use of the data. So they can ask to see it. What do you have about me? They may want to correct it if there are mistakes in the records, or they may want us to give it to them in a portable format. They may want us to forget them, to erase the data. Basically, there are different ways that the data subject can limit or revoke the license to use that data. And in responding to one of these subject access requests, in our case here, the global retail company would be dealing with primarily the customers, but flip it to the employment side, and you can see where this might become a tool for separated employees to begin a little pre-discovery, to understand what it is you have about them in your organization. And that can be a burdensome thing to discover if you're not ready for it, and to fulfill.
All right,
Tom,
thanks.
if I might add something in here,
Yeah.
we tend to think that particularly the rights in the last bullet are something that's sort of unique to EU citizens, but we have variations of each of these here in play in the United States. And I will give you a couple of examples. If people haven't hit them personally, you know someone who has. If you've ever changed cell phone carriers and your cell number traveled with you, that's a great example of portability. It's the exact same premise that that number belongs to you as opposed to the person that was selling you cell phone coverage. So that's just a very practical example of portability that people can relate to. Another one about either correction or being forgotten would happen to anybody that's been a parent to a high school senior. You know, or if you don't, you're going to hit it, that when your child turns 18, you're no longer privy as the parent to that child's school record. Whereas all the way up until age 18, you can request that at any time from the school and they have to give it to you. But once that child turns 18, they become essentially the custodian or the data holder, and it has to come from them directly. You cannot, as a parent, request or be granted that access. So those are just two kind of personal or almost consumer-oriented examples of these types of concepts that we're already using in the US. We just don't tend to think about it that way. Now translate those up into a more enterprise context, and you start to see how these things do have ramifications in the US.
It also, Sandy, feels a little bit like the Freedom of Information Act as well, that the press often uses to, compel organizations to provide information about a subject that they're interested in that is, considered for public use or non-privilege or non-confidentiality reasons.
Exactly. It has the same dynamic that David just described of a sort of on-demand requirement to hunt through tons and tons of data just to find that kind of relevant files that fit the bill of the request, whether it's a FOIA request or a DSAR.
All right, thank you.
And just to connect this more fully back to the U.S., this sounds very much like discovery. In a way, it's part information governance, part discovery. We're looking for responsive content in a big pile of mixed information, and we need to produce it, probably after some review and redaction, to the requesting party. So it's not unknown in American enterprise. It is just coming from a different perspective and without the case or controversy that triggers discovery in the U.S. litigation scenario.
All right, that's a great teeing up of some of the things that we're going to be speaking about in a few moments. But before we do that, Sandy, I think we're ready for maybe our first poll. And so our first audience poll is going to be, the question is going to be, which of the following GDPR uses most concerns you? We have a number of selections there. We ask that you can let us know what your feedback is as to kind of what your perspective is. Let that go for a few seconds. All right, I see it looks like from the early results, the two that seem to stand out are coordinating company-wide to implement data security and also proper data storage and access, which is an ideal segue, I think, to our slides that are coming up. So why don't we proceed? I think before we step through the DSAR use case and introduce some of the technology approaches to address that, we still have some additional background to cover. And David, maybe this is a good one for you to start with. The title of the slide is which U.S. sectors and what types of companies are most likely to face GDPR scrutiny, and what constitutes risky data and/or risky data management. What are your initial thoughts on that one?
Yeah, it's tempting to say everyone could be impacted by this, but I think most at risk are organizations that are doing business in or with the acquisition of EU resident data. So multinationals are certainly a segment that should be taking notice. E-commerce companies and participants in e-commerce activities So I have a client who is a utility that runs a museum around the utility's founding in a certain part of the country. They market the museum domestically, but are also picked up internationally, and so have international tourists registering and buying tickets online, and soon to be accessing an online gift store that now brings a quasi-municipal entity into the reach of the GDPR for a potential segment of their business that they hadn't really thought about as being global. So it does get you in ways that are somewhat subtle. Data brokers and analytics firms, clearly anybody dealing with big data that is not geographically bounded is going to be looking at these issues. Dealing with the approach you take, I think, is a classic risk-reward analysis. And as you said, Tom, at the outset, the penalty scheme is announced, but we don't know how it's going to be implemented, and we don't know what the velocity or the volume of those enforcement actions are going to be. And I think that definitely informs your risk analysis, the likelihood of your falling into a GDPR violation, and the amount, is sort of that classic multiplier. So looking at that risk analysis, it helps inform your decision. And then doing a gap analysis, understanding where your data is and how close to compliance you are. And it may be that you're closer than you think because of the sectoral approach the US takes to privacy management in the different verticals or sectors of the economy, and in your own business practices through either InfoSec initiatives or compliance initiatives. So I think that's where you take your view of how do I do GDPR compliance preparation and where do I spend my money. It may be that the DSARs example is something that you want to focus on because those could be coming in the door before a regulator would be turning their eye towards you. And I think we've talked a little bit about what constitutes personal data. It's data that identifies or can be used to identify a person. So it's very broad, much broader than the US concept of personally identifiable information. Sure, it's all that, but it goes to that can be used to identify the identifiable person. So that tracks back to phone numbers, IP addresses, CCTV surveillance, those sorts of things that we may think are a bit attenuated from PII. And then there are classes of information that are even more highly regulated, and those include sensitive data, so biometric, genetic, information about party affiliation, union membership, sexual orientation, those sorts of things are another type of data that needs even more special treatments. And those rules apply whether you are a data controller or a data processor. Both of those terms of art under the GDPR. Essentially, a processor does stuff with the data, performs operations on it, and a controller directs those activities, how the data is going to be processed. And yes, you can be both a controller and a processor, and yes, the GDPR applies to both. So lots going on this slide, but I think it is a risk approach and a prioritization that's needed here to see what you should be doing, keeping in mind that you don't want to leave this all the way, off your agenda, because that may inhibit your agility, your business agility to take opportunities in emerging markets in the EU, in new lines of business through merger or acquisition that would bring you more fully into the GDPR. So I do think it's a balancing act, and I think it's an awareness function at your organization.
All right, so let's say that I'm a U.S. company. I've concluded that I do need to comply to this regulation, and I'm eligible. What are some initial thoughts David and Sandy, what are some things that I can do to start and get started to address some of these compliance risks?
Well, I think at the 10,000-foot level, you wanna look and see, am I trafficking in this information? Do I have information that is subject to the GDPR? If your answer is yes, I would begin a data mapping exercise to understand where that information is and how it flows. It could be a very short exercise if your information is limited to customer information and payment card information, and it lives in a structured database and it goes nowhere outside that database, and you have lockdown control of that. The problem is that probably isn't anybody's circumstance, because that payment card data goes to a processor to process the credit card data, so there's a transfer of it there. But it's not also a scorched earth endeavor, because lots of what you're dealing with on this data map are excluded right out the gate. You're focusing on personal data and how it moves through your organization, and if you transfer it to an outside organization. And understanding that can, I think, be handled by a cross-functional team doing ordinary diligence around core aspects of your business. How do I interact with people? Where do I store their data? And then cross-reference the use of that data with the purpose for which it was obtained. Am I using the data consistent with the expectations of the data subject? So if I am giving you data to buy a toothbrush and that's all I'm doing, and I give you my name, my address, and my phone number, and the things you asked for so that you can ship me the toothbrush, I would expect you to use that in the fulfillment of my order and then no more, right? I didn't sign up for your loyalty program. I don't need a subscription to toothbrushes. I'm just going to take that data. If it turns out that you're brokering that data to the dentist association for targeting advertisements on teeth whitening, that would not be something I would expect. So I would look to the processing activities, the retention, and the use. Retention is another thing, and Sandy, I'm sure, has strong feelings about this. Data should be retained, personal data should be retained only so long as is necessary to complete the purpose for which it was given, and to retain it for any other statutory reason that is not inconsistent with its use. But that retention for a statutory reason, don't continue processing it. Don't continue, analyzing it and working with it if you only need to keep it for a tax purpose. And then finally, we've talked about legitimate purposes. What am I using it for? So that's really where I would start to understand the breadth, the scope, the potentials for my exposure to the GDPR. Sandy, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would pick up right there, because there are two almost sort of assumptions in what you've said. One, that you know what data you have in the first place, and two, you know where the personal data lives. And a lot of the folks that we speak with are kind of at a loss, not by anybody's fault. We just sort of, as a society, data has grown exponentially. Every time there's a merger and an acquisition, there's another, 20 terabytes that joins the mix. And so one of the things that is kind of a very early obstacle to complying with GDPR, or frankly anything else, is being able to get your hands on around the data in the first place. And that's where some of the technologies that we're going to talk about, notably AutoClassification, can come in and help solve that very first obstacle, so that you can go from essentially kind of almost blind data storage to seeing or intelligent data storage, so that you can get to the questions that are listed here and that David just very nicely just took us through.
All right, so that's a good place. I think if we can pause, Sandy, before we get into the technological solution discussion, why don't we do another poll question? And our next poll question is what type of organization do you represent? And we're just really interested in understanding the profile of this audience, so again, we can address some of the specific concerns that arise from each of these categories. All right, and Sandy, you definitely you represent the technologist viewpoint of our panel today, and I think our discussion from the last few minutes, sets the table for you to maybe introduce some basic concepts of some technology solutions that your company supports. So why don't we start there with the next slide?
Okay, I'm going to just share those results in case you want to see who's here today. Kind of a nice smattering across different sectors of the U.S. economy. So you can kind of see who's who. And then we'll proceed. Okay. So one of the strongest technologies that help people go from essentially staring down data in the various silos where it lives. So you have data stored in your email system, you have data stored on file shares, maybe more recently in things like SharePoint sites or collaborative places up in the cloud. So data is existing in a lot of places. That can be hard to get your arms around in anticipation of GDPR, or really in anticipation of that first DSAR that's going to come in, on May 29th at 6 a.m. And so there are technologies that kind of specifically look across data silos and specifically exist to sort of crawl that data and figure out what it is and what it contains. That technology that I just described is called AutoClassification. And basically what it does is do kind of a quick in-place analysis of files and content, looking for whatever it's been directed to look for. So in the case of GDPR, you might very well instruct those engines to look for personal data, as David described it to you. While you're there, you might as well look for other useful things, like what type of content was it? Was it a contract? Was it a health record? The actual document type might shed some light on the appropriate treatment of that content. Just because a name is present, if I have an email that says, I ran into Tom Bonk in the hallway, that's not necessarily a problematic instance of his name, Tom Bonk. But if for some reason, and I do not, Tom, but if I did somehow have access to your medical records from the last time you were in the hospital, that's a wholly different context of your name. So just a simple search is not really the answer. The context of the usage of that name is very, very important. And that's where AutoClassification kind of has a leg up on just simple searching. So we thought that we would take you through just at the highest level what AutoClassification is and how it works, and show you how that technique can be used to manage these GDPR DSARs as a kind of a case in point of something that's we think is going to be happening regularly under GDPR. So just briefly, again, what AutoClassification is a combination of two types of technical activity. The first one is analyzing files, analyzing content. And yes, that can be files that are native electronic, or what we say ESI in this country. It can also be files that were once upon a time paper and have been scanned into systems. If you're not familiar, there's a technique called OCR, optical character recognition, that makes those images readable by engines like this. So one way or another, you have AutoClassification analyzing the content of files and creating sort of a profile of rich metadata, maybe 20, 30 different fields of metadata. In a GDPR context, it might be metadata about what type of document is this? What was its intended use case? How long should it be kept? Does it have highly sensitive data present? In the US, we call it PII. Elsewhere, as David said, there's a broader definition. What exactly is in the contents of this document? That rich metadata becomes almost a checklist of attributes about each file. That's sort of the first half of auto-classification. The second half is to utilize those attributes and utilize the text to run a sequence of rules. Rules are basically if-then statements that say things like, well, if Tom Bonk's name is present and it's being used in a sensitive manner and it is under a DSAR request, then pull this file to report back and perhaps maybe auto-redact out anything that is not related to Tom Bonk in that email or in that file. And then produce that. Again, you're hearing words that are kind of like e-discovery. Produce that up in a fashion that it is deliverable back to Tom Bonk, the data subject requestor. So that's a little bit how it would work in an auto-classification context. I do want to just briefly touch on the bullet on the bottom. There are kind of two approaches to thinking about utilizing automation to solve these kind of common use cases like a DSAR. You can organize your content, get everything kind of analyzed, indexed, tagged, and then you're ready for that first DSAR to come through. That is kind of a boil the ocean approach. I'm not going to say whether one is better or worse. That one is certainly costlier up front, but it will save you down the line. The other approach is to wait for the DSAR and then run your indexing at that time. That obviously is going to put a lot of weight and a bit of a delay on that DSAR. Fortunately, ever more processing power helps solve that one. So it really is a question of how many do you think you're going to get? How frequently do you think they're going to arrive? And if you've done your data mapping prior, what do you need to kind of crawl through to analyze? If you haven't done your data mapping and you need to crawl everything, then I would recommend you start at the back, prepare everything, and get ready for the onslaught. If you have, and it's really only a small little universe, then you might as well wait for that DSAR, kick off, your runs at that time, go get what you need, and come and go. So it really becomes a function of how much you have, how frequently you expect the DSARs to come in, and what the scope is that you need to analyze. Okay, well, we actually kind of covered this one off. Look at that. I'm going to jump right ahead. So here is essentially how auto-classification works, and I'm describing the use of a Valora product called Powerhouse. That essentially does the things I just said, kind of analyzes content on a kind of broad enterprise scale basis. So you have kind of two approaches generally. You can either kind of put the content into Powerhouse the way you might do in an e-discovery type of workflow, or you can leave it where it is and have things be processed in place. That's the more common use case at the enterprise scale. Either way, one way or another, as I said, you're going to kind of get to a text rendition of your content. So if it's a Word file, it's going to extract text. If it's an image file, it's going to run OCR. And then that tagging step that I described, that rich metadata creation, where we're tagging attributes of that content, and in a GDPR context, specifically looking for things that have to comply with GDPR. Either we're doing that in the general case, that's the do everything and then look forward, or we're looking specifically for instances on a specific DSAR, that's the look backwards technique. Either one is going to kind of result in sort of, as I said, that checklist of attributes. And then finally, we go through a rules engine. And a rules engine really is going to determine the disposition of each and every file. Is it required to be disclosed to the subject requester, or is it not? Is it protected? Is it safe? Or does it need to be locked down? Does it need to be forgotten, corrected, etc.? So that's what the disposition does. That rules engine says, okay, this file or this content either fits the bill or doesn't fit the bill, or if you really want to get fancy, to what degree does it fit the bill? And then you can decide where your thresholds are. and then go ahead and take the appropriate action based on the result of those analytics. So that's kind of how it works in a nutshell from top to bottom.
Hey, Sandy, can you speak a little bit about this concept of data in flight and why data in flight could be an ideal stage where a company could index its ESI in this fashion, as you just described, for the purposes of doing an auto classification exercise?
Sure. So generally what we mean with data in flight is data that is intentionally moving. So the common examples are, okay, we're moving stuff up to the cloud. That's a very common one today. That would be data in flight. Another one would be, our old email archiving system is no longer being supported, or our old ECM is no longer being supported. So we're going to be migrating content over into something else. So whenever data is moving kind of en masse like that, one more example would very common M&A. So we are inheriting the data stores of this company that we acquired, or we're divesting this branch of our business and we need to kind of extract out what stays and what goes. So those are all examples of data in flight. And once you have data in flight, it's always an excellent time to use that opportunity to intelligently sort through the data that's in flight, because you have sort of a golden opportunity to make sure that the landing of that data is clean and kosher and organized, and only the data really that should be stored gets stored. It's an excellent time to remove rot. If you don't know rot, redundant, obsolete, trivial. For those firmly in the e-discovery camp, think of it as a kind of form of deduping. As you're kind of preparing for the landing of the data, you might as well organize that all up. Remove rot, set up your folder taxonomy if you're going to be going that way, tag everything for its critical tags, including GDPR tags, like this file contains sensitive data or personal information for these 10 people. So you might as well kind of use the opportunity of data being in flight to consider that as an opportunity for data getting organized and cleaned up and GDPR or litigation or compliance ready.
Thanks, Sandy. I think this is an ideal time for us to take another poll break and introduce our last poll question of the day, and that is, how close is your organization to achieving full compliance with GDPR? And so we have a number of selections, starting with what is GDPR, which at times I feel that I personally am still at that stage. But curious what the audience is feeling in terms of the organizations they belong to and where they're at in the spectrum of preparedness. And we'll let the poll run for just a few more seconds.
We're almost halfway.
All right. Sandy, can we display the results?
I can.
Wow, this is a smart group.
Yeah.
40% we got this. Well, that's awesome, and it's probably a testament to your interest in the topic and why you're here today. So that's great to hear. All right, Sandy, let's move on to what I think is maybe the most important, or one of the most important slides that we're presenting today. And this is this slide ties it all together for me, and hopefully it will for the audience as well, as to where data can reside in enterprise and what are some of the benefits of using an auto classification tool.
Sure. So we've kind of described auto classification broadly and in a GDPR context. And it's probably was evident by what we were just talking about, data in flight, GDPR is really one of many, a kind of growing chorus of reasons to get enterprise data under control. Maybe GDPR is actually driving the conversation for your organization. It certainly is for a number of them. And that becomes this wonderful opportunity to have GDPR be sort of the main reason, but you get all these other benefits from doing so. So let me kind of show you what that looks like. This is what a typical modern day enterprise looks like in 2018. As I mentioned, there's data everywhere. Nobody really has a fantastic handle on everything. Sometimes individual data silos have a good handle on that silo's data, like your email server handles your email very nicely, but it has pretty much nothing to do with your N drive or R drive that has file shares. They're completely unaware of each other. So we have this notion of data living in all of these places. Any one of these could potentially have personal information that might be subject to a DSAR. So it's kind of time as a world that we get our arms around this multi-siloed issue. So we have kind of data where it lives, that's what I'll call data silos. And then we have data as it's needed. These are all those use cases that are requiring access to these data locations and kind of looking across them. We're talking about GDPR, which would probably almost certainly fall in this third bucket right here. We've already brought up litigation. Usually right in tandem with this discussion will be enterprise search. And then what we're really kind of talking, we talked about migration for data in flight. What we're kind of talking about really at the end of the day is proper data management across the board. So you have these kind of at the bottom of the stack, you have these myriad use cases that are desperate to look across all the data silos. And that is really the function of what auto-classification does. It serves as that traffic cop that's aware of content in here, even live as it's changing. Because of course, email is being received and sent every second inside your organization. So it's not enough to just analyze once. There has to be kind of a continuous, perpetual understanding and control of the data back here so that it can be served up intelligently and obeying both retention and security boundaries into all of these use cases. So that is where we put Powerhouse. That's how we use the auto classification technology that I told you about. And just for those following Valora, this is Black Hat is essentially a seeing mechanism, a data visualization platform that lets you see both across the silos and into the applications.
Got it. All right. So I think what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about a prescription, if you will, things that summarize a lot of the or some steps that companies can take. That's a bit of a summary of what we've been speaking about over the last 45 to 50 minutes. And just to recap, what we think is an approach that makes a lot of sense for companies is to, an area where we can start, or company can start with what I would consider as a low key and, introduce some automation, have some low cost solutions in place, specifically for a U.S. appetite. We feel there's really kind of four areas to start with. First is, as David was discussing, it's important to have just a general lay of the land, starting with a data analysis. And there's some technology solutions that we've offered up here, presented as potential solutions to address this particular area. That'll help you answer the questions of how much data you have. How much personal data is contained within the data that you have that's active. Is there an opportunity to remove redundant, obsolete, or trivia type ESI? What are the implications of your email platforms and storage policies around those email platforms and archiving type approaches and retention schedules and things like that? The other thing is, this is no surprise to anybody who's in the e-discovery world, PST files, which are basically containers of emails, exist everywhere, shockingly everywhere within a corporation. A lot of it is due to the fact that many users have control over, what they can do in terms of archiving or keeping, private sets of emails for their use. There are a lot of PST hoarders out there. A lot of that's going away, I think, with the advent of transition to cloud email, but still, certainly PSTs. It's no surprise to anybody that that could be a rich area for mining this types of information. A second initial step would be lay out and describe your goals. Where you want and how you want your data to live on an ongoing basis. And these are all, by the way, what we would consider very good in reasonable information governance type approaches that, again, fit nicely with the topic of GDPR. It's all under the same umbrella. GDPR and privacy concerns is just another reason to for a company to have good information governance policy and execution of that. Focus on the use cases, and certainly GDPR is likely going to present several specific business processes that will have to be developed. I think I would suspect many companies will get some heartburn, at least initially, as they have to deal with things like DSARs, probably have to go through a manual and highly labor-intensive and possibly costly effort to get through the first couple. But hopefully, there's a recognition that there are some technology solutions in hand that can help automate and make those business processes tightly controlled and a bit routine. Ultimately, I think what everyone wants to point to, instead of having these one-off events that are done in manual, sort of haphazard execution type processes, to have a request being done entirely electronically with some automations to automation pieces to manage the entire process from start to finish. Sandy, I know this next slide, lays out what we consider some use cases for and how AutoClassification can address some of the use cases in addition to GDPR. I don't know if you have a moment to fly by a couple and maybe highlight some that are of particular relevance or importance.
Sure, and I purposely left the slide like this because for those that are really interested in GDPR, you'll see that it sort of shows up often as kind of, oh, and you get GDPR too, it's sort of the afterthought. In this context today, this is really the primary driver, but it works the same way in that, as Tom just mentioned, this is really all about proper data management, execution, and compliance. And so the things that are mostly driving GDPR is a variation of security. And it tends to hit when data is in flight, which would be migration, and it tends to fall under the context of remediation. In other words, get this data under control and get rid of that data that we no longer need to keep. So those are kind of, I would say the three together are the primary drivers. But what's fun about kind of getting your data under control for information governance is once you have one of these bullets kind of notched under your belt, the rest can often come along very easily and cost effectively. So you're kind of solving a lot of problems all at once when you kind of take on your first auto classification project.
That leads us nicely to our next slide. I know we're wrapping things up. Certainly, I think the proof is in the ROI. And Sandy, I don't know if you can comment a little bit about why we think auto classification not only addresses and is a good sound solution for GDPR, but certainly fits in well with an information governance approach that corporations can use.
Sure. I think that at the broadest sense, the days of essentially not really knowing or understanding what data we're responsible for, those days are ending. And GDPR is a very good example of that. It's no longer sufficient to just have data. You have to know why you have it and that you have it appropriately and you're using it appropriately. So in order to essentially justify those statements and in many cases actually prove compliance with them, you're going to need some sort of technological solution that is A, doing the work, and B, proving that the work has been done. That's just a great setup for auto classification. And what's fun is you get an ROI out of it too. Yes, you get the reduced risk. That's always a nice ROI, but it's kind of soft. You can get the really hard, number ROI by just looking at the reduction in storage. Just the removal of rot will typically remove about 30 or 40% of data currently kind of randomly under management. That alone probably pays for, no joke, an auto classification solution maybe 10, 15 times over. So it's very easy to prove ROI, which is nice because it's easy to drive budget requests with that.
All right, I know we're coming up to the end here, so again, at conclusion, our summary. Hopefully, the audience, you've taken away three things. First, we provide some educational information around how to assess where you fall, or if you're subject to the GDPR and compliance to GDPR. I think awareness is key. This feels like deja vu all over again for those of you who've been in e-discovery for many years, like I have been. This very much feels like when the new federal rules of civil procedure came out in the mid-aughts regarding companies' obligations to discover electronically stored information and not say we're just going to leave that off to the side. I think just having an awareness where your risks are under the GDPR, I think, is half the battle. We think GDPR compliance fits in very nicely, and it's just one more reason of many good business reasons to invest in information governance solutions and technology to help address some of the challenges of just an ever-expanding volume and complexity and the risk associated with managing information in an enterprise. And that hopefully you take away that we have some we would consider entry-level, easy to implement, easy to start technology solutions that start to address these problems. We're super excited about what the future is in terms of our development of the technology and services around the technology, and we think auto classification holds great promise to addressing GDPR concerns as well as more generally information governance activities. With that, I think we're up at the end of our hour together. Thanks so much to all attendees for your time and your attention. Thank you, David and Sandy, for helping us guide us through this presentation and discussion. Hopefully we have more of these into the future. Certainly, if you have anybody in the audience have any questions for us, please feel free to reach out. We're happy to answer those for you. Thank you and good day.